Hello everybody and welcome back to Louis Bertou's Music Reviews. Today I'm talking about Miles Davis's Kind of Blue. So, Miles Davis's Kind of Blue. Possibly the most famous jazz album by the most famous jazz musician. So you might be thinking, well, what is there to say about this album that hasn't been said by a million people already? Nothing. Oh, okay. End of review. Aha, but no, the review doesn't end there. In fact, it begins here. Kind of Blue is something of a change of sound for Miles Davis, a change away from the more standards approach of a record like Birth of the Cool, which often has a much more dense arrangement and a lot more quick chord changes, whereas on Kind of Blue we've got a lot more simple chord progressions and a cooler approach, I guess, to composition. Davis had already flirted with this cooler, more spacey approach to jazz on his 1958 record, whose name escapes me, even though I have written it down here. I just can't read my own writing. Yeah, it's a neat little record, that, actually, which I think perhaps can get overlooked just because it did directly precede the famous one, Kind of Blue. And on that album, really, Miles Davis did go headlong into the cool, spacey approach to jazz. One thing about Kind of Blue that's quite noticeable and quite renowned is how consistent it is, almost to the point of being repetitive or samey. But I think a closer look at the tracklist does reveal how there is a lot of variety here, even if it doesn't seem that way. The simplicity of the first track, So What, must have been so boundary pushing for its time. Consider the fact that there's only really two chords in this song. And that two chord progression, I guess you could call it, gets moved up a semitone and then back again, and that's basically the chord progression, really. It's a great example of modal jazz, where instead of having a chord progression that perhaps tells a story or goes through a lot of different changes, we just really have one change, or one or two, and really the soloists play over these modes rather than over these quick chord changes. So you've got this more modal track that opens the record up, but then the next track, Freddie Freeloader, is a lot more of a standard blues progression, just kind of more business as usual. I mean, it's still super cool and super new, contemporary sounding for the time, but it is nonetheless a blues. Side A ends with this lovely ballad, Blue in Green, which again is a change of pace. So we've had modal, blues, and now a ballad, which again provides more variety, I think. Yeah, Blue in Green. If blue is supposed to be a metaphor for like depression or sadness, then maybe blue in green is referring to finding the sadness in happiness or finding the sadness in the everyday, which is a bit sad really, but also quite poignant, I guess. It certainly adds emotional weight to what is already quite an emotional track. End of side A. On side B we have two songs rather than three songs. We begin the side with a track called All Blues, which again changes the pace by being in 12/8 rather than 4/4. The rhythm is felt in groups of three rather than groups of four, and even though I said it was 12/8, you could also think of it in 3/4 as like a jazz waltz. So yeah, while All Blues is still a standard blues, as the title would suggest, the time signature sets it apart from the rest of the tracks and still continues to add variety. And then the closing track, I think, is almost at odds with the rest of the album. It's very different in terms of just groove. There's a lot less groove here. The drummer Jimmy Cobb plays brushes rather than sticks. And he's really just sort of hitting the cymbals very slowly rather than keeping a really forward-moving groove going. And this is definitely more of a modal track, similar to the first one, but without the groove, I guess. So there's certainly a fair bit of variety when it comes to song forms on this album. However, when it comes down to it, pretty much all the songs still follow quite a conventional jazz form, I guess. You typically begin with the head, which is the melody, and then after that, each player takes it in turn to solo over the chord changes of that melody. And then they take it in turns, typically beginning with like a trumpet or saxophone and moving through the rhythm section and then ending on drums before the head is replayed. Though on here there's not a lot of drum solos, which I will get onto later a little more, but yeah, it's mainly trumpet, then sax, and then piano, typically. And that similarity or consistency in regard to soloing does wonders for the album's cohesion. However, I can imagine some listeners would perhaps be put off by how samey the album is, and I do understand that argument, but for me personally, I enjoy the solos. I think they're very high quality, even if they are conventional, and really, if you want a jazz album, like one that sticks to the conventions of jazz, I think this is just a great one to listen to. But I suppose if you're not typically bowled over by the conventions of jazz, maybe check out some of Miles Davis's later work, some of his more experimental ones, where him and his co-players are pushing boundaries a little more in their solos. Off the top of my head, Agata, I don't know, or Dark Magus, or something like that. One where they're really, hitting it a little more, hitting some of those blues notes, those sweet, sweet, out-of-the-scale blues notes. However, those of us content with a little more simple and chilled-out approach to jazz should get a lot of mileage out of this record here, this cool jazz classic. I mentioned before about how there's no drum solos on this record, and I think that's for a very important reason, because having drum solos, I think, would interfere with the record's cool sound and cool vibe to a point which is detrimental. Because really, I think a defining characteristic of Kind of Blue is how cool it is. And I think that coolness is predicated on two main reasons, the first of which is the drummer, really. For me, the gold standard of tasteful jazz drumming is Jimmy Cobb, or at least the drum parts that Jimmy Cobb laid down on this record here. He really knows when to stick to something just so simple, something as simple as just hitting the ride cymbal on crotchets, ding, 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 but then also when to bring in just these moments of great high dynamic, just these occasional hits that really, I think, shock the listener almost, and provide dynamic contrast and huge amounts of interest and excitement to the listener. I think my favourite moment on the album, and perhaps jazz in general, is when the band kick in on So What near the start. And I think that is due to Jimmy Cobb's just perfectly well-timed and well-balanced drum fill. If I wasn't so afraid of copyright law, I might even include that little snippet of music in my review here, because it is so wonderful, but alas, I do not have the gonads. An anecdote about that moment, actually, that I heard is, apparently, Jimmy Cobb thought he'd hit the ride cymbal too hard at the start of So What when he comes in. And I think we can all agree, myself included, that he certainly didn't. And it's quite humorous to think that my favourite moment on the album and on jazz, in jazz in general, might not have even happened had Jimmy Cobb been a little more restrained. So yeah, that's the first reason I think why this album is so cool sounding. It's because of those drum parts that are so tasteful. The second reason, though, is, for me, just the ensemble as a whole, rather the rhythm section as a whole. The amount of restraint shown from bassist Paul Chambers, pianist Bill Evans, and drummer Jimmy Cobb, forming this kind of rhythmic section unit. Is that even a phrase? I don't know. But yeah, the restraint shown from each of those players, as well as the confidence and their assurance to play what's necessary, I think creates this great, cool, but also forward-moving groove that underpins a lot of the record. There's a great sense of space in the rhythm section, on account of the player's restraint, that I think seems to imply that not every player is giving everything all at the same time, all of the time, and in fact are holding things back. It keeps us listening, I think, because we haven't been given everything. Because really, it's up to the soloist to provide the bravado and the excitement, I guess, whereas the rhythm section's really more about just keeping everything down, keeping everything grounded. And really, in my opinion, coolness is grounded into every inch of that rhythm section. Overall, this album is very consistent, to the point where, to some listeners, it perhaps could even seem samey. But as we've discussed before, there is still a lot of variety, I think, in the tracks and the way each song is constructed. Like, you've got the modal tracks, you've got the ballad track, you've got the one in 12/8, these kind of things, where at least some effort was made to keep the record interesting, and to include a lot of variety. Once you've accepted that the solos on here are quite conventional by jazz standards, as well as the forms themselves, the soloing forms, you can really listen deeper, I think, and really pick up on some of the subtle nuance of this album. For example, there's moments when like gestures, rhythmic gestures or melodic phrases get repeated across the ensemble. Like one person plays it and then it gets echoed in another musician's playing, which is just great to hear. Similarly, there might be a dynamic swell or a particular hit from Jimmy Cobb on the drums that instills just a more impassioned solo from the soloist. Again, another nice thing that you might not notice on first listen. These are both little subtle nuances that can make themselves apparent after you've gotten past how perhaps conventional sounding the solos are, you know. Kind of Blue really is a winner in that regard in terms of the subtlety and nuance, and I think it lives up to most of the hype. I think like this is a very well hyped album. It's established itself in the canon of not just jazz albums but albums in general, top 10s, top 100s, all over the shop. And I think yeah, it does live up to most of that hype. I'm not going to say it lives up to all of it because I think, you know, this album's always going to be slightly overrated, but yeah, for what it is, it's really the best in its genre. So to wrap up, just as a little recommendation thing, I was going to say, if you like experimental music but haven't managed to crack jazz yet, as I was when I was about 18 years old, I'd say maybe don't check out this album. I'd say maybe go for something like Eric Dolphy or Charles Mingus or Ornette Coleman or even like Albert Ayler and Peter Brotzmann. These guys who really took what Davis did on this record and pushed it further. Just because those albums are a little more exciting and might get you into jazz a little bit easier than something a little more conventional as Kind of Blue. But for those of us already headlong into our jazz journey, those of us who choose albums for listening like fine wines for drinking, Kind of Blue will have established itself as a stayer, as a keeper in our listening practice, I guess. I am certainly one of those, and for that reason, I rate Kind of Blue a strong 9 out of 10. Yeah, classic, absolute classic, and I'll see you in the next review. Perhaps something from 2021 next time, or maybe another classic. Who knows? I'll see what I'm feeling. But yeah, see you in the next review. Bye-bye.